Chapter 7. A Kingdom in Chaos. Dyaxes and the other warriors, with the exception of Errol and Eadril, set off for Teluvia the following day. They reached Edgewood just before nightfall. The streets were empty, and all was quiet. The travelers came to the inn owned by Eadril's friend, Brundle, and stopped for the night. The following morning, Dyaxes was awoken by the noise of a large crowd of people pressing through the street outside the inn. He went to the window and looked on with a grim face as people and carts urgently moved past in the road below. A knock on the door drew his attention away from the window. Dyaxes opened the door and saw Brundle standing there, rather sheepishly. "I hate to disturb you, sir, but there is a messenger from Argyon here to see you," Brundle said. "He says it is very urgent, and I, for one, do not doubt it." Dyaxes and the other knights went to the dining room of the inn to meet with the royal messenger, who was named Windrian. "We are under invasion," Windrian said soberly. An army from the west marched into Teluvia shortly after midnight. The city of Norfolk fell in less than an hour. I made it out of Argyon just before they laid siege to it. Norfolk fallen? Argyon under siege? "Surely this cannot be true," Cerebus said in a panicked voice. "I am afraid it is," Windrian insisted. "The army from the west must be powerful indeed to have swept through Norfolk so easily," Ectheon said. Like Cerebus, his complexion had turned very pallid, and he was on the edge of despair. "Norfolk was virtually defenseless," Windrian explained. "The battlements of Argyon are much more formidable. That being said, the army from the west is indeed a fearsome force, and the shell of an army defending Argyon will not last long under such a relentless assault." "So what would my father have us do?" Ectheon asked. "His Majesty King Eluthian is a realist," Windrian said. "He knows that you are valiant warriors, but there are only a handful of you, certainly not enough to break the siege of the royal city. He has dispatched me to go to our brethren in the north, the Varillians, to petition King Ilias for assistance. He has also asked that all of you come with me, for as long as you live, there is hope for Teluvia, even if Argyon should fall." "The king is right," Dyaxes said. "There is hope for Teluvia as long as we live. But we will not go with you to Varillion." "What are we going to do then?" Ectheon asked. "We are going to turn this handful of elves into an army," Dyaxes replied. Dyaxes walked out of the inn, followed by the other warriors. He directed the knights to take some of the wagons from in front of the inn and use them to block off the avenue. With their path barred, an angry crowd of refugees began to mass in front of the inn. The dark-cloaked commander climbed atop one of the wagons to address the unruly mob. There was much commotion as one of the elves in the crowd recognized him. "It is the Dragonslayer," the elf shouted. Normally, that title would have brought cheers from the crowd. Now it only brought jeers and shouts of contempt. "Where was this mighty warrior when Norfolk fell?" another demanded. "Why do you stand here while Argyon is besieged?" "The reasons for my absence were of great importance to the kingdom," Dyaxes explained. "There is no time to discuss the details of my mission. It is enough for you to know that it was with the kingdom's best interest in mind that I left. A lot of good you did us by leaving." Someone in the crowd shouted. "What good could I have done by staying?" Dyaxes challenged the crowd. "Our forces were ill-equipped and greatly outnumbered. Do you not see? If I had stayed behind, I would either be dead right now or barricaded within the walls of Argyon. What good would I be then? It is fortunate that I was not there, for now we have a second chance." There were more cries of discontent from the mob as the king's sons were noticed. "Look, it is Prince Ectheon and Prince Cerebus," a person in the crowd yelled upon recognizing the princes. "Cowards! Why are you not fighting alongside your father?" Another in the mob challenged them. "They were probably fleeing to the north, the whole lot of them," someone shouted. Dyaxes had had enough of the boisterous crowd's jeering. His face became flush with anger, and his voice roared like thunder as he shouted, "What hypocrites you are! I do not see any of you defending your homeland. Why, there are more males here than females. That is, if you can still call yourselves males. And you dare to brand the king's sons cowards? They have just come from greater peril than you could ever imagine, all with the bleak hope of somehow saving your thankless lives. You are the cowards. Go ahead, run like frightened children to the north, to the safety of Verilion. Where will you run to when the Ursals cross over the White Mountains and pour into the northern lands? What will you do then? The commander's tirade quieted the crowd. The roaring mouths of the angry elves fell silent as they hung their heads in shame. A meek voice then came from the crowd. But what can we do? There is much we can do, Diaxis said. First, we must form an army. But we have no weapons, someone called out. We will arm ourselves with whatever we can, the commander said, clubs and rocks, if necessary. We may not prevail, but at least we will die fighting, and that is far nobler than being shot in the back as you run away. The choice is yours to make. You can either summon your courage and fight for your country, or you can give in to your fear and continue your trek north. All those who wish to fight alongside me, stand where you are. Those who wish to leave are free to pass through the barricade. The knights pulled apart the wagons to make an opening. However, the action was unnecessary, as not a single soul passed to the other side. Diaxis smiled in approval as he looked over his army. The new recruits were teeming with enthusiasm after having heard the commander's powerful speech. Shall we set off for Arjan then? One of the elves shouted. We are not going to the royal city, Diaxis announced. Looks of confusion filled the crowd, prompting several to ask, where are we going then? Telesway, Diaxis shouted. Telesway, one of the new soldiers exclaimed in disbelief. Why Telesway? My dear friends, the commander said, you are brave souls, but there are far too few of you to challenge the mighty Ursals. We will find more elves in Telesway to join us in our effort. Diaxis and the young knights set off at once for the southeastern elven town. Their newly formed army followed behind them. They passed many other citizens who were heading north along the road. When these travelers saw the new army, many joined its ranks. By the time the war party reached Telesway, the size of the force had doubled. When they reached Telesway, Diaxis gave another rousing speech. By day's end, the commander had managed to scrape together an army of roughly 500 recruits. The new soldiers were divided into 5 regiments, each commanded by one of the knights. It was the first true task of leadership given to the young warriors. Diaxis called a meeting of the knights to bolster their confidence and discuss their strategy. Well, we have an army, now what are we going to do with it? Arlon asked. We are going to Argion, right? Ectheon assumed. No, Diaxis said bluntly. Even if we had a well-trained army of this size, which we do not, we would be hard-pressed to defeat the troops surrounding the city. What can we do then? Cerberus asked in frustration. Why did we even go to the trouble of rounding up an army if it is of no use to us? If you ever want to become a great leader, you cannot let yourself get flustered so easily, Cerberus, the commander said. Marching into Argion would not only be dangerous, it would be predictable as well. You see, wars are not won through brute force alone. A commander's ability to outwit his enemy is often the deciding factor. It was brute force that allowed the Ursals to take Norfolk and surround the royal city. It will be our superior planning that will drive them out. We must ask ourselves, what would force them to leave? If we were in their place, what would make us give up the attack? The young elves pondered the commander's question. The torchlit room that housed the meeting of Teluvia's young military leaders fell silent as words gave way to thought. Finally, Ectheon spoke. What if we attacked their country? He suggested in a rather hesitant tone. The others looked at him as if he were crazy. Attack Ursulus. Arlon gasped. Surely you are joking. Diaxis jumped to the defense of the prince. That is exactly what we must do, he said. But what chance do we stand against the defenses of Ursulus if we cannot even defend our own country? Dialus asked. Often when a tyrant like Urkai marches into war, He builds up a mighty offense at the expense of his defense, Dyaxis explained. He has most likely let down his guard. All of his attention is focused on the forests of Teluvia instead of his own country. So you are saying that we must attack one of his cities to get his attention, Cerebus concluded. Precisely, the commander said. When he sees that his nation is under attack, he will have to pull back his forces to defend his country. We will divert the war from Teluvia to Ursulus. Surely, as low as his defenses may be, he still has enough soldiers back home to repel an army as small as ours, Arlon said pessimistically. You are right in that respect, Dyaxis agreed. That is why we must find more people to help us. But we already have all the potential soldiers left in Teluvia, Ectheon pointed out. The Teluvians are not the only victims of Urkai's oppression, Dyaxis said. There are many opposition forces at work within Ursulus itself. The most powerful of these is the Elcadian Republic. We must join forces with them. Together, we can impose a realistic threat on King Urkai. We must leave for Elcadia as soon as possible. Due to the invasion, the elves could no longer travel safely on their own roads. They were forced to make a new path through the Golden Woods. To avoid the possible detection risked by the movement of a large caravan, Dyaxis ordered each of the 5 battalions to leave the city at half-hour intervals, starting with his own. The first band of elves set off under the cover of night, heading southwest through the forest. The darkness, combined with the elves' knowledge of the territory, provided a great advantage for Dyaxis' army. It was doubtful that an Ursul scouting party would venture too far from the main roads after nightfall. Still, the commander had scouts of his own guarding all flanks of his advancing army, just in case agents of the enemy were in the vicinity. After marching for a good part of the night, it became obvious that the army would soon have to stop and rest. The pace at which Dyaxis drove his soldiers was a brutal one, especially for those who were not accustomed to such a journey. The soldiers were growing weary, and dissension was beginning to set in. Taking this into account, the commander brought the group to a halt upon reaching Dunsborough. The tranquil village of Dunsborough was hidden in the southernmost reaches of the forest. Though its population was small, the town was of great importance to the kingdom, for it was the religious center of Teluvia. It was here where the archbishop resided. He lived and worked in the cathedral of St. Kai Elthian, which was the site of the kingdom's holiest ceremonies, as well as a school for young priests. It was an ideal place for the army to seek shelter for the night. While the soldiers retired for a much-needed rest, Dyaxis stayed in the small scouting camp on the edge of town, awaiting the arrival of Ectheon and his regiment. It was not long before the prince arrived with the second group of recruits. Dyaxis turned the watch over to Ectheon, and then departed to seek an abbreviated night's sleep in a nearby inn. Shortly before dawn, Arlon led the final group of soldiers into the town. When the sun rose, there was no sign of the army. All the soldiers were quietly asleep indoors. The urgency of the mission denied the elven soldiers the luxury of a lengthy rest. Dyaxis roused his regiment shortly after dawn. Though it would have been safer to wait and travel again at night, time did not afford them that luxury. Every minute was crucial, for those defending the royal city could not hold out long. Dyaxis implemented the same plan as the night before, in which he would go first, and the other knights would follow in turn. They would meet at the riverside town of Goldleaf. There, they would attempt to cross the river. Spanning the wide, lazy waters of the Norsis presented a problem for the army. There was a great danger of being seen by the enemy, and an even greater vulnerability to attack once they reached the open water. Dyaxis hoped a town as small as Goldleaf would remain unnoticed by the Ursuls. The people of Goldleaf had heard the news of the invasion from citizens who had escaped the fall of Norfolk by traveling downriver. No one in the town had seen any Ursul soldiers, and no one planned on retreating any further until the danger presented itself. This was welcome news for Dyaxis. However, he still wanted to complete the crossing as soon as possible, just in case the residents of Goldleaf were wrong. The river crossing would take place in 2 parts. A large, wooded islet divided the river into 2 channels, one wide and lazy, the other narrower and swifter. It was this separation of the river that had given the city of Norfolk its name. Dyaxes made plans for the crossing before the rest of the army arrived. He commandeered every floating craft available to use to transport the soldiers across the river. By the time the final division of soldiers arrived, under the lead of Arlon, Cerberus's soldiers were fording the river. Dyaxes and Ectheon waited on the other side with their battalions. The noon sun was high in the sky. To the north, smoke from the fallen city of Norfolk could be seen rising into the air. The mighty elven port city had been the first to succumb to Urkai's aggression. The river told the tale of the conflict as debris floated south from the city. The usually heavy merchant traffic had tapered off entirely as word of the invasion made its way south. Once all the troops reached the western bank, the army prepared to move on. Since there would be no ports at the second river crossing, Dyaxes ordered the soldiers to bring the smaller rafts with them. Crossing the western branch of the Norsus River would be a much slower and therefore more dangerous process. Using only the smaller rafts, it would take several trips just to get one regiment across. At such a pace, it would take several hours to get the entire army across. By late afternoon, the Elven army had reached the east bank of the western Norsus. Dyaxes sent Arlon ahead with a small scouting unit to make sure that all was safe before the army left the cover of the trees. Though it was still daylight, the densely wooded area provided an excellent shield from enemy eyes. The scouts returned shortly with news that all was clear. Satisfied with Arlon's report, Dyaxes led the first group of soldiers to the river. After checking once more to make sure the coast was clear, the elves placed their rafts into the cool waters of the Norsus River. The western branch of the Norsus flowed much swifter than its eastern counterpart. It was the duty of the first soldiers who crossed the river to run a rope from one side to the other so that the crossing would be quicker and safer for the rest of the army. This first crossing took several minutes to complete. Those were very tense moments, as the soldiers were highly visible and extremely defenseless in the open water. Upon landing on the west bank, the soldiers secured the rope around a nearby tree. A few elves were needed to transport the rafts back to the other side of the river, so the next group could use them to come over. The sluggish pace of the river crossing worried Dyaxes. He ordered his soldiers to maintain a lookout in all directions, as he himself peered anxiously upriver, fearing a patrol of Ursal troops would appear at any moment. An hour after the crossing began, the 3rd Regiment, led by Cerberus, started their trek across the river. Dyaxes, who had been among the first to cross the river, heard a rustling in the trees behind him. He turned around and stared intently into the woods. After scanning the wall of trees for about a minute, he had failed to see anything out of the ordinary. But then suddenly, his attention was diverted back to the river as an unexpected commotion broke out.